Rising 150 meters or 490 feet above sea level, the Acropolis of Athens dominates the Attic plain and the modern metropolis that surrounds it. For millennia, this natural stronghold has served as the symbolic and physical heart of the city, hosting its most significant religious, military, and political structures through successive periods of history. Already during the Bronze Age, a Mycenaean palace is believed to have stood on the rock, serving as both fortress and residence for the early rulers of Athens. However, it was during the city's classical golden age that the Acropolis achieved its most celebrated form. Under Pericles' ambitious building program in the 5th century BC, the plateau was transformed into a magnificent sanctuary crowned by the Parthenon, the Propylaea, the Temple of Athena Nike, and the Erechtheion, masterpieces that continue to be admired and inspired to this day. During the turbulent centuries of late antiquity, the Acropolis' role shifted increasingly toward defense. Its perimeter was fortified with new walls, and the old temples were converted to Christian churches. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, the site continued to serve as a fortress, hosting Byzantine and Frankish garrisons before the Ottomans took over in the 15th century. But the Greek War of Independence marked a decisive turning point in the Acropolis' history. Not long after the last Ottoman troops left in 1833, Athens was elected as the national capital, and work began to turn what had up until then been a town of around 10,000 inhabitants into a modern European city. But while new government buildings and civic institutions rose on the plain below, the sacred rock lost its practical function as a fortress and was declared an archaeological site. From then on, it would take on the role of a symbol, becoming a monument to the country's classical past. But this was not the only path considered. When Greece gained its independence, it was originally organized as a republic. However, the assassination of Governor Ioannis Kapodistrias in 1831 threw the country into turmoil. In response, Great Britain, France, and Russia, who had all aided Greece during the war, intervened to restore order. In 1832, they decided that the country would become a monarchy, and offered the crown to a young Bavarian prince named Otto. As a result, the construction of a royal palace became an urgent necessity in Athens' transformation into a modern capital. The project attracted the attention of several architects who all had ambitious plans for the building but differed on where to construct it. Among them, the boldest approach was taken by Carl Friedrich Schinkel, widely regarded as the preeminent German architect of the 19th century. His plan was nothing less than to stand eye to eye with the Parthenon, constructing a splendid palace on the narrow space of the Acropolis, overlooking the burgeoning city below. In this video, we'll discover the various unrealized designs for King Otto's residence, and in particular the scheme by Schinkel, whose many illustrations allow us to view in detail one of the most beautiful and unique palaces never built. At the same time as Athens became the Greek seat of government, another European capital was rapidly emerging as one of the largest cities on the continent. In the peaceful decades following Napoleon's defeat, Berlin, the capital of Prussia, doubled its population from 200,000 in 1816 to 400,000 by 1846. To reflect the city's growing importance, new monumental buildings were constructed, creating a grand and modern center for the Prussian state. The man responsible for this transformation was the chief building director, Carl Friedrich Schinkel. Many of the buildings he designed are still prominent landmarks of the city, like the guardhouse known as the Neue Wache, the Prussian national monument for the Liberation Wars, the Royal Theatre or Schauspielhaus, and the Altes Museum, where the royal art collection was displayed to the public. In his architecture, Schinkel combined a wide range of influences, from medieval Gothic to Italian Renaissance and even modern industrial architecture from England. But his primary source of inspiration, at least during his most productive period, could be found in ancient Greece. During a formative journey to Sicily in 1804, Schinkel had personally experienced the dimensions and forms of Greek temples, and after returning to Berlin, the young artist spent much of his early career painting stage sets, many of which showed fantastical views of ancient monuments. A clear line can be traced from these early experiences to his later designs, like the palace on the Acropolis. That being said, Schinkel never actually set foot in Greece, and the idea behind the project wasn't his own. Instead, it emerged from King Otto's first visit to Athens in 1833. On this occasion, he and his elder brother, Crown Prince Maximilian of Bavaria, were shown around the Acropolis, which at the time still retained much of its Ottoman form, including a small mosque standing in the middle of the Parthenon. After returning to Munich, Maximilian related what he had experienced to a friend of his, the future King Frederick William IV of Prussia. Being himself an amateur architect, Frederick William was struck by the idea of a royal palace on the Acropolis, and suggested the leading Prussian architect and his occasional collaborator, Schinkel, as the right man to design it. After some convincing on the part of Maximilian, the architect agreed to take on the project, devoting the early mornings of his busy schedule to producing a large number of illustrations of his vision. Broadly speaking, Schinkel's plan was to remove all vestiges of the medieval past and reveal the ruins of the Periclean monuments, while also creating a new building that harmoniously blended in with them. Like in ancient times, visitors would enter the Acropolis through the monumental gateway known as the Propylaea, beyond which they encountered the colossal statue of Athena Promachos, standing 9 meters or 30 feet tall. Originally created by Phidias in the 5th century BC, it stood as a famous Athenian landmark for 1,000 years before being moved to Constantinople, where it's believed to have been destroyed during a riot in 1203 AD. But Schinkel planned to have the ancient bronze statue recast and once again take on a prominent place in the silhouette of the Acropolis. On either side of the Propylaea, he placed the stables and coachhouses needed by the royal household, while the large elongated space between the Parthenon and the Erechtheion is occupied by a racecourse inspired by ancient hippodromes. A carriageway running alongside it would have brought you to the main entrance of the modern palace, a grand porticoed gate called the New Propylaea. Owing to the crowded nature of the citadel, the residence had to be constructed on whatever land remained east of the Parthenon, a small and difficult site to build on that Schinkel nonetheless took full advantage of. Here, he laid out a complex series of halls and galleries, connected via delicate gardens and courtyards to form a residence that was both convenient and beautiful. Externally, the palace lacked a unified facade and was instead organized into several substructures of moderate height so as not to compete for attention with the ancient monuments. Only the south side, facing the Saronic Gulf, presented a fairly regular appearance in the form of a long colonnade running from the royal chapel in the west to a large circular tower in the east. When entering the palace via the New Propylaea, you would have found yourself in an open courtyard surrounded by rooms intended for higher officials and dignitaries. An assembly hall occupied the space directly opposite the portal, while a covered gallery extended to your right. Schinkel illustrated this space in detail, revealing a sumptuously decorated hall leading up a gently rising staircase to a massive door. This door marked the ceremonial boundary between the public and private sections of the palace, and opened into a vestibule where the king would personally receive higher guests. Beyond this room, the gallery continued until reaching a second courtyard, around which the king's living quarters were arranged. They also extended through an adjoining wing to the west, at the end of which stood the royal chapel. In similar fashion, the queen's rooms are arranged around a corresponding courtyard in the more secluded eastern parts of the building. Here we also find the round tower, whose main floor would have become a spacious living room for the family. An open balcony under a leafy tent roof stretches around the exterior, offering shade and a space for relaxation with spectacular views of the surrounding landscape. The most impressive hall that the palace had to offer would have been located between the two courtyards of the royal couple. It was to be a lofty space, nearly as tall as the Parthenon itself, and would have featured 4 giant columns of black marble, contrasting beautifully against the deep red color of the walls. The roof structure above is adorned with gilded animals and mythological creatures like lions and griffins, while 2-story pilaster arrangements carrying divine figures stand at each end of the room. Beyond them, to the north, is a garden adorned with grass, flowers, and orange trees, while the other end of the hall is connected via 2 smaller rooms to the previously mentioned colonnade on the south front. Thereby, someone sitting in the inner garden would have been able to glimpse the clear blue water of the Aegean Sea between the forest of columns. Meanwhile, the more utilitarian parts of the palace were discreetly tucked away in the basement below these spectacular rooms. The baths were to be found below the rotunda, while other areas contained service rooms, kitchens, and living quarters for the staff. As a final touch, Schinkel would unify his architectural composition with living ornament. The contrast between the ancient and new was to be softened with fragrant rose gardens, vineyards, orange trees, and olive groves, interspersed with cypresses, palms, and laurel bushes, which would create a very different impression to the austere, rocky landscape that we know today. When Schinkel had completed all the drawings, he sent them along with an accompanying commentary to Maximilian in Munich, who in turn forwarded the package to his brother in Greece. Because of the informal nature of the exchange, Otto never wrote back to the architect, and it would take 2 years before Schinkel was informed about what had happened to his project. In the spring of 1836, his friend Prince Hermann von Pückler-Muskau was visiting Athens, and explained in a letter that the king was very impressed by Schinkel's project and considered it the ideal solution. But the unhappy financial situation of the country had forced him to choose a more modest design, which was mere prose by comparison. The prince continued, writing, "Yours is not feasible here. You would have to send Phidias and Callicrates along with it, and above all, the material resources that Pericles had at his disposal. People here are so poor that they cannot even repair the road to Pentelicus, in other words, the mountain where the marble of the ancient Acropolis had been quarried, and so the columns of the portico at the new palace will be made of brick." With Schinkel's proposal being set aside, the Acropolis' future as an archaeological site was sealed. The post-classical fortifications, barracks, powder houses, and the mosque were removed, and the ancient monuments began to be pieced back together from scattered fragments on the plateau. But despite this preservationist approach, one modern addition was made to the ensemble. In 1865, a museum began to be built on the eastern part of the site, where Schinkel had planned his palace. It covered much of what would have been the Great Hall and the Queen's apartments, and was expanded to a modernist design in the 1950s. While the building is still standing, it closed its doors in 2007 when its antiquities were moved to a new museum at the foot of the Acropolis. Schinkel's plan was not the only one to be rejected on financial grounds. Already in 1831, 2 of his former students, the Greek Stamatios Kleanthes and his Prussian colleague Eduard Schaubert, had arrived in Athens to create a topographical map of the town. 2 years later, they were commissioned by the government to draw up the first official plan of the new capital of Greece. In it, Kleanthes and Schaubert proposed a complete transformation of Athens into a modern and a majestic city of culture, learning, and art that could compare favorably with other European seats of government and live up to the lofty ideals associated with its name. About half of the old town would be demolished to create an open-air museum showcasing the various ancient monuments in the area. The rest was meant to be carved up into neat blocks and integrated into the rational plan of the new city, which extended north to form a triangle. All of its main avenues would converge at a grand square at the top of this shape, where the royal palace would have stood. The building was placed in such a way that the king, standing on his balcony, would command views of all the main sights of the city and beyond. The beautiful Lycabettus Hill to the east, the ancient Pan-Athenaic Stadium to the southeast, the Acropolis directly to the south, and finally the port of Piraeus, far in the distance in the southwest. However, implementing this plan would have required large amounts of private land to be expropriated, making it far too costly for a small and impoverished country that had just emerged from a decade of war. A more pragmatic approach was necessary, and in 1834 the Bavarian court architect Leo von Klenze was sent to Greece to provide just that. He proposed leaving much of the old town intact, while modifying the new parts of the city to better take into account the hilly and inclining terrain of the area. The broad strokes of Klenze's plan can still be seen today, although it has gone through numerous modifications, especially regarding the placement of important buildings. At the top of the triangle, where Cleanthes and Schaubert proposed placing the royal palace, he instead envisioned a metropolitan church. But what ultimately happened was actually more in line with the original plan. In the end, a square was built here, but without the palace. It's known as Omonia Square, and while the area around it would remain nearly deserted until the late 1800s, it is now a bustling crossroads at the heart of the modern city. Von Klenze instead moved the royal palace to a more tranquil site at the southwestern edge of Athens. A collection of public buildings and an ornate garden would serve as a buffer from the nearby Old Town and from the busy street leading to Piraeus, while large, informal gardens extended from the building up to Areopagus Hill near the Acropolis. Klenze, who apart from being an architect was also an accomplished painter, created beautiful illustrations of his design, revealing a building of colossal proportions but comfortably nestled in the Mediterranean landscape. Stylistically, it reflected his preference for the Greek Revival style, and made prominent use of vivid colors to decorate the exterior, something that would have originally been seen on the Parthenon and other ancient monuments as well. But this vision was never to be realized. The main problem with Klenze's building, apart from its enormous size, was the site he chose for it. As his main rival at the Bavarian court, Friedrich von Gärtner, pointed out, the plot of land was too uneven, which ironically was the same thing Klenze had criticized the previous site for. It should also be noted that the area in question, known as Kieramekos, had up until Roman times been the main cemetery of Athens. As one could only expect, it turned out to be full of ancient tombs and artifacts, and an old graveyard was perhaps not the most auspicious site for the home of the king. Finally, the task of designing the palace was handed over to Gärtner, who chose yet another site, this time at the foot of Mount Lycabettus. Here, at the eastern edge of the city, he proposed a large rectangular building, whose Spartan appearance would make it much more affordable than previous proposals. This design was accepted, and began to be implemented in 1836, with money lended to Otto from his father, the King of Bavaria. The building was completed 11 years later and would serve its function as royal palace until 1924, when the monarchy was abolished. In the following decade, the Greek parliament moved into the building, and although the monarchy was temporarily reinstated during the middle of the 20th century, parliament has remained there ever since.